You should start thinking about downsizing, Margaret. A ranch is too much for a woman your age anyway. Those were the words my daughter-in-law would say years later, believing I had nothing left worth taking. What she didn't know was that on the day she married my son, I was carrying a secret that would change everything. I'm Margaret Hayes, and when my son Ethan married Vanessa Carter on a warm June afternoon in Wyoming, everyone believed they knew exactly what my future looked like. They saw a 69-year-old widow standing alone in the second row of a small white church, smiling through tears as her only child began a new chapter of his life. What they didn't see was the envelope tucked safely inside my purse. 3 weeks earlier, I had sat across from my late husband Frank's attorney in a quiet office overlooking Main Street. Outside, pickup trucks rolled past old brick buildings that had stood for generations. Inside, my entire life changed with a few signatures. Frank had left me everything connected to Hayes Ranch. Every acre. Every grazing lease. Every water right. Every structure. The ranch had been in his family for nearly a century, stretching across thousands of acres beneath the wide Wyoming sky. Most people assumed it would pass directly to Ethan one day. Even Ethan assumed that. But Frank had other plans. He trusted you, the attorney told me as he slid the documents across the desk. He wanted you protected first. I remember staring at the papers, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto my shoulders. The ranch wasn't just land. It was memories. It was the place where Frank taught Ethan to ride a horse. The place where we celebrated anniversaries and family barbecues. The place where we buried our old dogs beneath cottonwood trees near the creek. Before I left that office, the attorney asked a simple question. Will you tell Ethan now? I looked out the window and thought about my son. I thought about the wedding approaching. I thought about the excitement in his voice whenever he talked about Vanessa. Then I shook my head. No, I said quietly. Not yet. At the time, I couldn't fully explain why. Maybe grief had made me cautious. Maybe I simply wanted one thing in my life that belonged to me before the world started making plans for it. Either way, I kept the inheritance private. The wedding arrived beneath clear blue skies. Vanessa looked beautiful walking down the aisle. Ethan couldn't stop smiling. Watching them exchange vows, I felt genuinely happy for both of them. I believed our family was growing. I believed love was bringing us closer together. As the reception carried on into the evening, I sat beneath strings of lights listening to laughter drift across the dance floor. Vanessa leaned over and squeezed my hand. Your family now, Margaret, she said warmly. I smiled and squeezed her hand back. Looking back, that was the moment I wish I had paid closer attention. Because sometimes the most dangerous lies arrive wrapped in kindness. The first year after Ethan and Vanessa married felt almost peaceful. Looking back now, I can see the small details I missed, but at the time I was simply grateful that my son seemed happy. Vanessa called me every Sunday afternoon. Sometimes she asked about recipes. Sometimes she wanted advice about gardening. Other times she invited me over for dinner, insisting that family should stay close. I remember sitting at their kitchen table one autumn evening, watching the sunlight spill across the hardwood floors while Vanessa laughed at one of Ethan's stories. She seemed warm, thoughtful, genuine. When Thanksgiving arrived, she insisted that I bring only myself because she wanted to prepare everything. At Christmas, she surprised me with a framed photograph from the wedding. She even wrote a note on the back thanking me for welcoming her into the family. I kept that frame on my mantle for years. The strange thing about deception is that it rarely arrives wearing a mask. Most of the time it arrives smiling. During those first months, I noticed that Vanessa was unusually interested in family history. She asked questions about Frank. She wanted to know how long the ranch had been in the family. She listened carefully whenever old stories were told around the dinner table. At first, I found it touching. Many young people have little interest in family traditions. Vanessa seemed different. One afternoon, while helping me organize old photo albums, she picked up a picture of Frank standing beside a weathered fence line with the mountains in the distance. "That property must be worth a fortune today," she said casually. I shrugged. "Land changes value all the time." She smiled and slipped the photograph back into the album. A few weeks later, she asked whether Frank had left detailed estate plans. Another time she wondered who handled ranch taxes after his passing. The questions were always wrapped inside ordinary conversations. Never direct. Never obvious. Ethan barely seemed to notice them. I did not think much of it either. At least not yet. Life moved forward. Seasons changed. Snow covered the pastures and later melted into spring grass. Calves were born. Fences needed repairs. The ranch continued operating the way it always had. Meanwhile, Ethan and Vanessa talked more and more about their future. Bigger dreams. Bigger plans. Bigger expenses. I listened politely whenever they discussed custom home designs or investment opportunities. They spoke with the confidence of people expecting life to become easier every year. Then one evening, as we finished dinner, Vanessa asked a question that lingered in my mind long after I drove home. She looked directly at me and said, "Margaret, if something happened to you tomorrow, who would inherit everything?" For the first time since Ethan's wedding, I felt a quiet warning settle into my chest. I answered Vanessa's question with a smile. "I suppose that depends on what everything means." She laughed softly, but her eyes stayed on me a second longer than necessary. Ethan changed the subject, and the conversation moved on, yet the question remained in my thoughts during the entire drive home. The highway stretched through open country beneath a sky filled with stars. Frank used to say that people reveal themselves when they think nobody is paying attention. For the first time, I started paying closer attention. Over the next several months, the questions continued. Not constantly. Not enough to seem suspicious on their own. Just often enough to form a pattern. Vanessa asked who managed the ranch books. She asked whether ranching was still profitable. She asked whether property taxes had increased. Once, while standing on my back porch watching the sunset, she casually mentioned that large ranches sometimes became burdens for older owners. Every question arrived wrapped inside concern. Every comment sounded reasonable. But together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. Then something happened that changed the way I saw everything. One Saturday afternoon, I stopped by Ethan and Vanessa's house without calling first. I had baked an apple pie and wanted to surprise them. As I approached the front door, I heard voices through the partially open kitchen window. I recognized Ethan immediately. Vanessa was speaking too, her voice lower than usual. I was not trying to eavesdrop. In fact, I almost turned around. Then I heard my name. I froze. "How can she still be living like that?" Vanessa said. "All that land and she acts like nothing is happening." Ethan sounded uncertain. "Mom has always been private." Vanessa sighed. "Private is one thing. Refusing to plan for the future is another." There was a pause. Then she added something that settled heavily in my chest. "Eventually it will all be yours anyway. She should start making smarter decisions now." I stood there holding the pie, staring across their backyard. Eventually it will all be yours anyway. Not if Frank's wishes were followed. Not if the truth remained exactly where I had kept it all these years. I quietly returned to my car without knocking. The pie sat untouched on the passenger seat as I drove home. That evening, I walked through the ranch house alone. Past the photographs. Past Frank's old chair. Past the windows overlooking the pastures. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether Vanessa was curious. Curious people ask questions because they want answers. Vanessa was asking questions because she already believed she knew what the answers should be. Once a suspicion takes root, ordinary memories begin to look different. That winter, I found myself replaying conversations I had almost forgotten. Little comments. Curious questions. Moments that seemed harmless when they happened. One afternoon, I pulled out an old box of photographs from the hall closet. Snow drifted across the ranch outside while the fireplace crackled softly in the living room. I sat alone for hours looking through decades of family history. There was Ethan at 10 years old, proudly holding the first trout he had ever caught. There was Frank repairing a fence beneath a bright summer sky. There were birthday parties, graduations, holidays, and countless ordinary days that somehow became precious once they were gone. The deeper I looked, the more I found myself thinking about Frank. During the last year of his life, he had become unusually protective of certain decisions. At the time, I assumed it was because he knew his health was declining. Now I wondered if there had been another reason. I remembered a conversation we had shared on the back porch one evening shortly before he passed away. The sun had been setting over the western pasture, turning the hills gold. Frank sat quietly for a long time before speaking. "Promise me something, Margaret." I laughed and asked what kind of trouble he was planning. He smiled. "Promise me you will never let anyone pressure you into giving away what we built together." I told him nobody would ever do that. He looked out toward the ranch instead of at me. "You would be surprised what people do when they think something belongs to them." At the time, his words felt strange. Almost unnecessary. Ethan had always been a good son. We were a close family. There was no conflict. No reason for concern. Yet sitting there years later, I could still hear the seriousness in Frank's voice. He had not been speaking casually. He had been warning me. As spring approached, another change became impossible to ignore. Vanessa stopped asking about family stories. She stopped showing interest in old photographs and ranch traditions. Instead, nearly every conversation drifted toward finances, future plans, property values, or retirement. It was subtle, but constant. Ethan changed too. Not dramatically. Just enough. Phone calls became less frequent. Visits became shorter. Sometimes weeks passed without hearing from him at all. I never complained. I never confronted either of them. I simply watched. And the more I watched, the clearer everything became. The kindness I once believed was genuine now felt conditional. As long as they believed a future reward was waiting somewhere ahead, they remained interested. The moment uncertainty entered the picture, the warmth began to fade. For the first time, I started to understand why Frank trusted me with the truth and no one else. The moment that finally removed all doubt came during a family barbecue in late May. Ethan and Vanessa had invited several friends to their house for the holiday weekend. The weather was perfect. Children played in the yard. Music drifted from a speaker near the patio. Everything looked normal. I arrived carrying a bowl of homemade potato salad and spent the afternoon smiling, listening, and keeping mostly to myself. At some point, I stepped inside to refill my glass of iced tea. The kitchen was empty, so I lingered near the open back door that led toward the side patio. That was when I heard Vanessa's voice. She was speaking to another woman I did not recognize. "Honestly, I thought there would be more," she said. The other woman laughed. "More what?" Vanessa lowered her voice, but I could still hear every word. "More money. More assets. Something." Ethan always talked about how successful the ranch was. Then I started looking into things and realized his mother lives like she is practically retired already. The women laughed softly. My hand tightened around the glass. "Maybe she is saving everything," the other woman suggested. Vanessa scoffed. "Trust me. If there was anything major, we would know by now." There was a confidence in her voice that struck me more than the words themselves. She was not wondering. She had already reached a conclusion. In her mind, my value had been calculated and assigned. The conversation continued. They moved on to vacations and home renovations, but I did not hear much after that. I quietly returned to the backyard and took my seat at a picnic table beneath an old maple tree. Nobody noticed anything unusual. Nobody noticed that something important had changed inside me. Until that afternoon, part of me had still hoped I was being unfair. I wanted to believe grief and caution had made me overly sensitive. I wanted to believe Vanessa's curiosity came from concern. But concern does not sound like disappointment. Concern does not measure people against potential financial rewards. As the sun began to set, Ethan joined me at the table. He smiled and asked whether I was enjoying myself. I smiled back and said yes. He looked happy. Relaxed. Completely unaware of the conversation I had overheard. For a brief moment, I felt more sadness than anger. Because the person being judged was not just me. It was also Frank's memory. Everything we had spent decades building together had been reduced to a number on an imaginary balance sheet. That evening, as I drove back to the ranch, the sky glowed orange behind the hills. For the first time, I stopped asking whether Vanessa truly cared about family. The answer had already revealed itself. The only question remaining was how far she was willing to go once she believed there was nothing left to gain. The shift became impossible to ignore by the end of that summer. It did not happen all at once. There was no dramatic argument. No confrontation. Just a steady change in tone that grew more noticeable with each passing week. One evening, Ethan called and asked if he and Vanessa could stop by the ranch. His voice sounded unusually serious. When they arrived, Vanessa carried a polite smile, but it never quite reached her eyes. We sat around the kitchen table where Frank and I had shared thousands of meals over the years. Outside, the pasture grass moved gently in the wind. Inside, I could feel a conversation approaching before anyone spoke. Ethan cleared his throat. "Mom, we have been talking about your future." Whenever people begin a sentence that way, it is rarely about your future. It is usually about theirs. I smiled and waited. Vanessa folded her hands neatly on the table. "We just worry about you being out here alone." I nodded. "I appreciate that." She continued. "This property is a lot to manage. The house is large. The winters are difficult. Maybe it would make sense to consider something easier." There it was. Not a suggestion. A direction. I asked what she meant. Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. "There are some wonderful retirement communities nearby. Beautiful places. Activities. Maintenance services. People your own age. People your own age." I looked around the kitchen. At Frank's old coffee mug sitting on the shelf. At the photographs lining the wall. At the view beyond the window. Everything they were discussing belonged to a life they did not fully understand. Ethan finally joined in. "It might be good to start planning before you have to." His words were gentle, but they carried a weight that settled heavily in the room. I asked whether they thought I was unable to care for myself. Ethan quickly said no. Vanessa quickly agreed. Yet neither of them withdrew the suggestion. Instead, they kept talking about convenience, practicality, and long-term planning. I listened quietly. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. By the end, they had discussed retirement housing, downsizing, selling assets, and simplifying responsibilities. Not once did either of them ask what I wanted. Not once did they ask how I felt about leaving the home where I had spent most of my adult life. After they left, I walked slowly through the ranch house. Room by room. Window by window. The silence felt different that night. Not lonely. Clear. For years, I had wondered whether I was imagining things. Whether grief had made me suspicious. But standing there in the home Frank and I built together, I finally understood something important. They were no longer treating me like family whose wishes mattered. They were treating me like an obstacle standing between them and the future they had already planned. The following week, I made an appointment with Frank's attorney. His office had not changed in years. The same leather chairs. The same framed photographs of Wyoming landscapes. The same quiet professionalism that Frank always respected. When I arrived, he greeted me warmly and asked what had brought me in. I placed my purse on the desk and looked directly at him. I think it is time for me to understand exactly how protected everything really is. He nodded as though he had been expecting that question for a long time. For nearly 2 hours, we reviewed every document connected to the ranch. Every deed. Every trust. Every legal protection Frank had carefully established. By the time we finished, one fact stood out above all others. Nobody could force me to sell anything. Nobody could make decisions on my behalf. Nobody had any ownership interest in the ranch except me. Frank had been thorough. Very thorough. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not anger. Not revenge. Certainty. The uncertainty that had followed me for years finally disappeared. I knew exactly where I stood. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared unexpectedly. I attended a local charity fundraiser in town. The event was small, mostly ranch owners, business owners, and long-time residents. During the evening, I ran into a banker I had known for years. We exchanged pleasantries and spoke about the community. Then he mentioned Ethan. "Your son stopped by recently." I smiled. "Oh?" The banker nodded. "Nice young man. Very ambitious." Something in his tone made me curious. What was he working on? The banker hesitated just enough for me to notice. I probably should not discuss details. I assured him I understood and changed the subject. Yet his reaction stayed with me. A few days later, Ethan called. The conversation began normally. Weather. Work. Family updates. Then he casually mentioned that he and Vanessa were exploring financing options for a larger home. I listened quietly. He spoke confidently about future plans, property investments, and opportunities that would become available down the road. Down the road. The phrase lingered in my thoughts long after the call ended. They were planning for a future they believed was already guaranteed. A future built on assumptions. Assumptions about me. Assumptions about the ranch. Assumptions about assets they did not own and rights they did not possess. That evening, I sat alone on the porch watching the sun disappear beyond the western hills. Frank used to say that truth has a way of arriving exactly when it is needed. As darkness settled across the pasture, I realized something important. I no longer needed to guess what Ethan and Vanessa wanted. The only thing left was deciding when they would learn the truth. 3 weeks later, I invited Ethan and Vanessa to the ranch for dinner. I told them there were a few family matters I wanted to discuss. Neither seemed surprised. In fact, Vanessa sounded almost eager when she accepted the invitation. The evening arrived cool and clear. The sun dipped behind the hills as they pulled into the driveway. I had prepared a simple meal. Nothing elaborate. Roast chicken, vegetables, fresh bread, and the blackberry pie Frank always loved. We sat around the same table where generations of family decisions had been made. Conversation remained polite through dinner. Work. Weather. Community events. Nobody mentioned the real reason we were there. After dessert, I stood and walked into Frank's old study. When I returned, I carried a thick folder. Ethan immediately noticed it. Vanessa noticed it too. I placed the folder gently on the table and took my seat. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I folded my hands and looked at both of them. "I think it is time we talked about the future." Vanessa straightened in her chair. Ethan nodded. I opened the folder and removed several documents. Deeds. Trust agreements. Ownership records. Legal certifications. Every page had been carefully organized. Ethan glanced down at the paperwork. Confusion crossed his face. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. I began calmly. Years ago, before Frank passed away, he made certain decisions regarding the ranch. Neither interrupted. The ranch does not belong to an estate waiting to be distributed. It does not belong to future heirs. It does not belong to anyone expecting to inherit control. Vanessa's expression tightened. Ethan frowned. I continued. Frank transferred full ownership to me. Every acre. Every building. Every right associated with the property. Silence filled the room. Complete silence. Ethan looked down at the documents again. Then back at me. You own everything? He asked quietly. Yes, I replied. I have for years. Vanessa stared at the papers as if they might somehow change if she looked long enough. They did not. I slid the folder toward them. These documents have been reviewed by attorneys and updated regularly. Everything is protected. Everything is clear. Ethan slowly opened the folder and began reading. Vanessa said nothing at all. The confidence I had heard in her voice for so long seemed to disappear without a trace. For years, assumptions had guided every plan they made. In less than 5 minutes, those assumptions vanished. And as I watched them sitting there across the table, I realized something Frank understood long before I did. The truth does not raise its voice. It simply arrives, sits down quietly, and leaves no room for misunderstanding. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. Ethan continued turning pages inside the folder, carefully reading documents he had assumed did not exist. Vanessa sat perfectly still. The confidence that had once filled the room was gone. In its place was something far less comfortable. Reality. Finally, Ethan looked up. Why did you never tell me? His voice was not angry. It sounded confused. Tired. Maybe even disappointed. I thought about that question before answering. Then I smiled gently. Because your father asked me not to rush. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? I stood and walked toward the bookshelf in Frank's study. From a small wooden box, I removed a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Frank's handwriting remained as familiar to me as my own. I returned to the table and placed the envelope in front of Ethan. Your father left this for me. Ethan carefully opened it. Vanessa watched silently. As Ethan read, the room grew quiet once again. Frank's words were simple. He wrote that the ranch represented more than land. It represented character, responsibility, and patience. He explained that ownership should never be handed over simply because someone expected it. Trust had to be earned. Stewardship had to be earned. Respect had to be earned. When Ethan finished reading, he lowered the letter slowly. His eyes remained fixed on the page. I could see years of assumptions falling away one by one. Dad thought this might happen, he asked quietly. Your father understood people very well, I replied. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Vanessa finally looked at me. I never meant to make you feel unimportant. Her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. I nodded politely. Perhaps not. But intentions matter less than actions. She lowered her eyes. There was nothing cruel in my tone. There did not need to be. The truth had already done all the work. Eventually Ethan folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. He looked older somehow. Wiser. More thoughtful. When they left later that evening, the conversation remained calm. No arguments. No dramatic scenes. Just silence and reflection. After their truck disappeared down the driveway, I stepped onto the porch and looked across the ranch. The same fields. The same fences. The same mountains standing against the darkening sky. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. Frank once told me that the greatest inheritance is not property. It is clarity. That night, standing beneath a sky full of stars, I finally understood what he meant. The ranch stayed exactly where it belonged. But far more importantly, the truth revealed exactly where everyone else stood.